Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our session today on assurance over sustainability reporting. I'd like to thank Peter for the kind introduction, and I will now introduce our panel, which will be discussing a series of issues related to the potential and problems and challenges of assurance over sustainability reporting. First, we have Stephen Taylor, who is a member of the Auditing Standards Board and a distinguished professor at the University of Technology in Sydney. We have Imre Nagy from the South African audit regulators. We have Sven Gentner from the European Union, and we have Jacco Moison from the New Zealand audit regulators. They have more complete titles, and I'll let them explain it in a little more detail in a second. The format of this session is we're going to tee up a number of questions related to the challenges of providing assurance over sustainability reporting. And this group is very well placed to explain their own personal opinions on these issues. And so over the next hour or so, we will go through a large number of issues related to assurance. So I'm going to let the panel first explain their interest in the topic and give a little more on their background so we can all appreciate where they come from as far as being able to comment on these issues. So I'm going to start with you, Stephen, because you're first on my screen.
Thanks, Robert. So minor correction. So I'm Stephen Taylor. I'm a professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, but I also serve on the Australian Accounting Standards Board. And right at the moment, we are in the middle of, I guess, a fairly controversial process of introducing to Australia some form of the first two standards produced by the International Sustainability Standards Board. And associated with that, of course, is a lot of questions around the assurance process. A lot of what is currently in progress in Australia is also occurring by direct regulation on the part of government, although that is fraught with some problems as well. And also my own research, a lot of the research that I've done over the years has been about the operation of audit markets. And so assurance of sustainability information, I think, raises many of the same questions that researchers have looked at over many years in terms of the market for financial assurance.
Thanks, Stephen. Imre?
Thank you, Robert. My name is Imre Nagy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors in South Africa. We regulate about 3,500 registered auditors, which is the equivalent of CPAs in the US. Our interest really is obvious as a regulator, and we are very interested in developments around sustainability assurance. We're tracking closely what's happening globally, as well as measuring best practice, emerging best practices for the benefit of the African continent and our country, South Africa. So I'm delighted to be invited, Robert. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this session and to learn and share. And good morning to my esteemed fellow panelists.
Sven?
Thank you, Robert. Hello, good morning to everyone. My name is Sven Gentner. I'm heading up the team here at the European Commission that deals with corporate reporting and audit. And of course, our connection to assurance of sustainability at the moment is the introduction of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards that apply as of this year to large companies in the EU and will then consecutively also apply to smaller ones. And within the legal framework, there is a requirement to get assurance on your sustainability report. So obviously, we're dealing with lots of questions around this issue at the moment. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. Glad to have you, Sven. And final member of our panel is Jacco Moison from New Zealand.
Thank you, Robert. I'm Jacco Moison, and I'm leading the three teams at the Financial Market Authority here in New Zealand. One is relating to the audit oversight. The other one is financial reporting that we have in New Zealand. And the third team is climate-related disclosures. So my interest is definitely in the last category. Also, New Zealand implemented mandatory disclosures from 2021. So we are now in our first year of reporting. So most of the topics that we touch base on, we will be trying it first. So I'm not sure if we have all the right answers, but we do our best to give the perspective from New Zealand.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll go right to it. I think I'd like to start with a very broad question just to sort of get us all going in the same direction. And that's, given that we are in different places in different parts of the world with different jurisdictions, I'm curious as to what your opinion is, the types of information that we should actually be talking about being assured. Is it extremely broad? Is it a scorecard? Is it qualitative as well as quantitative information? And I think I'll start with the EU and Sven, if you could address that, given what you guys are working on right now.
Sure. Well, as I said, we've actually established a legal framework already under which companies will have to report on sustainability-related issues, and it is fairly broad in the sense that it covers, first of all, both aspects of materiality, so impact and risks. And what we've established covers everything around environmental, social, and governance topics. And all of this will have to be assured. We're starting with limited assurance, and we have a possibility also to move to reasonable assurance later on. So really everyone in Europe is getting ready for this now, the preparers and the auditors. Obviously, there are questions around how exactly the assurance process will work, and I think the profession and the preparers are working through that at the moment. We also still have a question on how to establish standards for assurance, which we'll do at a later stage, probably based on what is happening internationally. So again, we have a fairly comprehensive framework here, and it's really all the information that's in the sustainability reporting that will have to be assured.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Jacco to follow up with that. And we hear a lot about the E in ESG. We don't hear nearly as much about the S and the G. So could you react to that, Jacco?
Yeah, so we took quite a different approach than the European Union, that our government has decided that we only need climate disclosures to start off with. So our ones are limited to that aspect of ESG. And also kind of we have quite limited things that needs to be assured. So our government decided that we start off with greenhouse gas disclosures to get limited assurance over. And currently we are still consulting if we should expand the assurance to the entire climate statement. That's undecided at the moment. On the contrary, if I talk to entities and their directors, they are fully liable for all their disclosures. So they are often seeking voluntarily assurance either from a law firm that they comply with all the requirements of the standards, or might go to a assurance firm to get voluntarily assurance anyway about their disclosures.
Okay. At this point, I'd like to, Imre, could you add the South African experience here? Do you do one or the other, or somewhere in between the EU and New Zealand?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. So from a South African perspective, we are not as advanced. Currently, we adopted voluntary application of sustainability assurance reporting, reporting and assurance. We're still in the process of legislating or mandating the standards and the assurance thereon. But yes, as you know, Robert, regional differences and inconsistencies plays a big role in the application and the readiness of countries in adopting reporting and assurance. And in South Africa, as much as we are advanced in understanding the assurance standards, etc., and the process, and we're part of that process, what is lagging behind a little bit is the legislation. That's going to take some time to catch up before these reporting standards and assurance are mandated in our legislation. So for now, it's voluntary adoption.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the legislative issue in a minute, but I figure we might as well cover Australia too. And let me give you, Stephen, a specific question. Do you see a problem if disclosures and the extent of what's assured varies across different industries or different clients or companies?
The way the Australian legislation is being developed at present is that there are no industry-specific aspects to it. So the requirements, both qualitative and quantitative, as they are in different areas, in terms of both risks and opportunities, the governance policies, and so on, that is all general. So there's no industry-specific component in the legislation or currently in the proposed standard that would apply. So the assurance would basically be common in at a conceptual level when it becomes mandatory in Australia by 2030, but obviously over that time period, when disclosure starts initially with large publicly traded firms from January 1, 2025, I suspect that there'll be quite a kind of evolution in terms of what those disclosures look like according to certain company characteristics. So without any industry-specific components as such, I suspect we're going to end up with industry-specific differences in the way information is provided and the way it's framed. And as a result, there'll be industry-specific challenges for the auditor as well.
Okay. It would seem to me that once this is well established, that some type of industry benchmarks will probably evolve. I'm not sure a company would want to be an outlier from the other competitors in their industry, but we'll see. Time will tell. Let me return to something Jacco said in passing, which was he talked about lawyers being a source of assurance. So who are the natural providers of assurance in this market? Stephen talked about audit markets in his introduction. I'm just curious. So let me go back to Jacco. Who else besides lawyers and chartered accountants could be playing in this market?
Yeah, in New Zealand, we have some specialist firms that have been providing greenhouse gas assurance for over 20 years. So we have some other providers in the market. Our legislators have kept it open on who can provide assurance on greenhouse gases. The only restrictions that they have set is that they have to follow the standard set by our standard setter. So there is a common denominator across all these firms, regardless where they come from. They have to deliver assurance against a prescribed set of standards. And at the moment, that is both the auditing standards and the ISO standards.
Okay, so let me follow up on that. When you're saying following the accepted standards, are you basically referring to IRBA standards?
Yeah. So that is one option. The other option is basically the ISO standards. So that's kind of also well-established standards, although not publicly available.
Sven, you want to follow up on that? Because I seem to remember talking to you a little bit about this in preparation and who the providers could be.
Yeah. So again, in our legal framework, there are fairly specific requirements here. So what it says is that obviously anyone who is doing audit already is qualified to do this as long as you follow the rules that are being established by the member states in the European Union. So we have at the moment different requirements in different member states in terms of training that you have to undergo. Sometimes it's 90 hours, sometimes it's 60 hours, depending on the member state, to do sustainability assurance. In addition to that, the member states also have the possibility to allow independence assurance service providers. So I think that's the kind of entities that maybe Jacco talked about that are also active in the European Union. But again, this is an option for the member states. And we don't have a complete picture yet because what we call transposition of the directive is will only be finished by July. And by then we will know a bit more in terms of which member state will allow this option, which ones won't.
Yeah, let me just go back to Jacco for a clarification. So when you say these assurance providers have been around for 20 years, are they chartered accounting firms? Are they engineering firms? What are these entities?
They are neither. So they are actually specialists in climate disclosures.
This is what they do.
So that's what they do. So actually no specific qualification required. So Robert, if you want to start a business in New Zealand tomorrow and you think you're qualified and you follow the standards, you can start one.
Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Imre, what's going on in South Africa regarding this? Who are the providers that you see coming into the market? You said you're not quite there yet, but who do you see as being the providers in the market?
Yeah, so what we've seen, firstly, we've recognized that there are indeed other non-traditional service providers entering the assurance space, and not only the traditional accounting or auditing firms. What we've also seen and recognized is that the mainstream standard setters and regulators have recognized the public interest importance of assurance, given the need to ensure confidence among users that the information is free from material misstatement. And that's why the project by the ISSB, IAASB, and IRBA the project was prioritized and fast-tracked. From a South African perspective, what we've seen now up to date is we've seen uptake and investment by traditional auditing firms, not so much other service providers, although we are aware that there might be some boutique service providers emerging. But I think, as Stephen mentioned, we've done quite a bit of legwork. The ISSB is also very active in Africa, and through one of their members, Dr. Ndidi, who's visiting African countries. I think she's flying across the continent on a daily basis to create awareness around the ISSB standards. But what we can say is that has started to pay off in that assurance providers are cautious of the fact that they will need to abide by both the reporting framework and the standards, as well as assurance standards, which includes independence. And some of them might shy away a little bit from that. So in South Africa, we've seen the Big Four, especially investing significant resources into upskilling themselves in providing assurance services, although we have to recognize that it is still voluntary. Give you an example, I'm aware of only one large listed company in South Africa that has voluntarily adopted ISSB standards. So we'll see how this develops. As Stephen mentioned, in respect of the framework, it's written in a manner that's aimed, to enable other accountants and other service providers to produce the assurance. But the big question here is it consistent? Can it be trusted? And will there be confidence by investors in the assurance products of these non-traditional assurance providers?
Okay, thank you. Stephen, I'd like to get comment on this. I'm going to, again, point you in a slightly different direction. Do you perceive that different types of service providers may actually follow different approaches to how to provide that assurance?
That's possible. It's interesting, Robert, that at present we know that in different countries around the world, some early evidence that I've seen on voluntary assurance of sustainability information, shows us that there are specialized assurers in addition to the traditional financial assurers, i.e. the accounting firms. What is really, I think, unusual in the Australian legislation, and remember that the Australian legislation is solely focused on climate, so everything else in the sustainability space is parked to the side. The Australian legislation proposes that assurance of the mandatory climate statement must be done by the financial auditor. So, which is quite ironic, because at the same time as our government and politicians and media generally are firing a lot of criticisms at the accounting profession about audit quality, they're actually proposing to make the auditing of the mandatory climate statement in Australia compulsory solely for the existing financial statement auditors. So it's actually a guaranteed line of business, as it were, particularly for the large accounting firms.
Is that true anyplace else across the panel? I know you guys have an experience with this being true anywhere else. No? Okay.
Although Robert is kind of audit firms that already have a foot into the door with entities might actually say, hey, if you want us to kind of look at this, or we use it for our audit, so we still have to look at it ourselves, we need to kind of be across all the elements of climate disclosure. So they might try to talk themselves in as a preferred provider from that area.
Okay.
Rob, if I can jump in quickly, if that's okay. What we've seen the Big Four firms doing in South Africa is they're positioning themselves as the preferred service providers, and they're upskilling their technical side of things. But, things that I've heard in the market is that they're mentioning that financial reporting and sustainability reporting are likely to run parallel with investors, giving both regard to financial as well as sustainability information, and the difficulty around having two service providers with two different opinions. There is also some complexities that the firms are saying by appointing the same firm, that problem is addressed. And then, of course, they also position themselves to say that auditors have always traditionally made use of experts and to rope in technical expertise or technical knowledge, which is already been there in the standard, in the extant standard. So the advantages that they say, they bring both a knowledge of assurance with the independence and the ethical requirements that's set at a very high bar, as well as they have access to the technical knowledge, both as you could say a one-stop shop. And they also understand very well the difference between assurance and non-assurance services to the same client. So where the non-traditional firms might struggle to get that right.
Okay. I'm curious, Sven, I think you said that the EU is addressing ESNG. Is that correct? Do I remember that? So do you feel that the same provider can address all three of those areas?
It doesn't say anything in the law that it has to be the same. But I mean, what we're seeing so far is that many of the companies that are subject to the reporting in this year, and these are really the largest companies only, that they very often turn to their traditional auditor, the auditor of their financial side, because of course there are links between the two, also because they already have an established business relationship. It's not always the case, but it is often the case, in particular for the larger companies. It'd be interesting to see what's going to happen when the framework starts applying also to the smaller firms, because there the picture might be a bit different.
Okay. Let me cycle back to something Imre just said, which is the issue of, in my mind, independence. Okay, the independence of the assurance provider. A few years ago, I can't remember exactly how long ago, there was a big debate in the United States, at least, about whether assurance over ESG was considered an assurance auditing function or a consulting function. And I still talk to people who think it's a consulting function. Therefore, you can't really do both because it would violate the auditing independence for financial statements. What do you, Stephen? Let me start with you. What do you think about that? You're nodding your head, so you can start.
It's only a matter of time. Certainly in Australia, with this legislative requirement that the mandatory climate statement will have to be assured by the auditor of the financial statements. It's only a matter of time before people, rightly or wrongly, start claiming that the assurance of the mandatory climate statement here, and I guess down the track, other sustainability reporting requirements, they'll be claiming that that's a threat to audit independence. Or perhaps they'll flip it over and claim that auditing the financial statements is a threat to the independence of assuring the mandatory sustainability reporting process, because it does seem that no matter how you structure things, there are people who are going to make an argument that independence is threatened. I think it's going to be a fascinating issue to see how firms earn returns on the financial assurance process versus the sustainability assurance process in environments where you have compulsory fee reporting. We'll be able to see what the fee paid for that sort of assurance is compared to assurance of the financial statements. And if it turns out that assurance of sustainability reporting is actually quite expensive for client firms, then my prediction is it's only a matter of time before people start claiming, especially if there are questions about the integrity of the sustainability reporting process in a few cases. We'll have people claiming that you need a law that separates assurance of sustainability from financial statement assurance. And I do say that slightly tongue-in-cheek.
Okay, well, Jacco, you're just across a little bit of water from Stephen. How do you look at the issue of independence, and how would you evaluate the independence of a non-chartered accountant provider?
Yeah, I see this service provided is as important as a financial statement audit. So I believe that these kind of ESG reports will have an influence on the pricing of an entity, or on how an entity is valued outside of the financial statement. So hence, the services provided, I think, it is very important, because people will rely upon that assurance provider that information is true and fair. Yes, I think traditionally this is an area where a lot of advisors have been given advice to entities, being it a audit firm, being it another practitioner that have a lot of knowledge about the climate as such. So yes, when it was all free for all, not mandatory, people have been advising on how to structure your entity, how, for example, to deal with offsets and on all that sort of thing. So yes, there is a large opportunity for conflict of interest within climate, because people talk about climate. It can be, what about individual products that you classify as green? You want to have a certification for that. Can that be performed by the same assurance provider than your entire climate statement? So I think it's a bit of a minefield, and people have to be carefully going through each of the services if it would breach their independence, yes or no, and what other people perceive to be impacting their independence.
That's very interesting. I actually can relate a story. Jacco, as you know, and I think everybody else knows, I spend a lot of time in New Zealand. And I remember working on a project 20 years ago with one of the CA firms about organic vineyards. And the challenge of, okay, if anybody's ever been to Marlborough, where a lot of the Sauvignon Blanc comes from, those vineyards are right next to each other. And if one is spraying and another isn't, how do you actually certify that it's the one that's not spraying is actually organic and not being a spillover effect? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And since I like wine, that's probably relevant to me. But anyway, let's go at the EU for this question. I mean, have you I know you're talking about these things, but what about independence, or how's this coming into play?
Yeah. No, I mean, this was fairly extensively debated when we negotiated the law, and there were different approaches here. I mean, some thought that it should actually be separated, that the assurance on the sustainability part should be done by different entities. But in the end, as I said, the compromise of the law actually says that it's any traditional audit entity, if auditor can do it, and if member states of the EU allow it, it can also be an independent assurance provider. I think there were lots of questions around who can actually do this, who will have the expertise, who will have the manpower to do that, what effect will it have on the market structure. Very difficult questions. I mean, we do have independence requirements in the law that governs audit oversight, and these apply obviously also here. But I mean, in terms of the legal qualification, this is not seen as a consulting, but as an assurance service, so that it's not seen as posing a direct threat to independence.
Well, I think this is a strength of the CA or CPA source of assurance, because the audit profession has this long tradition of independence. It's not always maintained in every case, but at least it exists and people understand it. If you talk about lawyers doing this, I don't think that type of concept necessarily even exists in most legal systems for lawyers, because their job generally is to represent their client. So I think this is potentially a comparative advantage for audit firms to be in this market, but then it can also be used again, as Stephen was talking about. I tend to agree with that eventually at least this is going to have to be discussed and debated, and may require a legal mandate of some sort to settle. Okay, so again, let's move on a little. Earlier, somebody said something about level of assurance, be it limited or reasonable. And I would argue, you could throw in essentially agreed upon practices or engagements. What do you guys think is the evolutionary going to be of the level of assurance? I mean, when you put it, if you think in terms of an financial accounting report, in the end, there's a bottom line, right? There's a number, we call it earnings. We got other numbers in there that are aggregations, and we provide an opinion on the statements taken in their entirety. When most ESG reports I've seen, there's a lot of numbers, but they cannot be reconciled to each other. And so how does this concept of reasonable assurance relate to something that is that essentially disaggregated? Do you think this will cause problems going forward, or is it just something we'll just adapt to? Imre, I haven't heard from you lately, so go ahead if you can, if you're willing.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert, that's a very important question that also came up at IFIA, the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators. It's a member body of 56 jurisdictions, and that's how I know Jacco, because we meet annually in person. What came up, sustainability, obviously, for audit assurance regulators is at the forefront, at the top of the list, one could say. And one thing that did come up is that one of the investors that we spoke to recently said that about 95% of investors are not accountants. So they don't understand the difference between limited and reasonable assurance. An audit report is an audit report for them. So I guess as we engage more with the users of financial and sustainability reporting information, it's becoming a clear picture is emerging in that investors want to trust what the companies are doing and is a true reflection, because it drives their investment strategies, and many financiers or investors have KPIs to meet as well in terms of both financial and sustainability targets. So I think the different reports and opinions provided by different service providers and especially the assurance level may confuse investors. For example, you have some saying using the words agreed upon procedures, which is not assurance really. Then you have limited assurance and reasonable assurance. So I think there's a great deal of education and advocacy that needs to happen here. But ultimately, I think the investors will dictate what it is that they want. And I can already see from the investors that we've engaged with both locally and internationally through IFIA is that they would lean towards preferably getting reasonable assurance.
Well, Richard raises a very important question in my mind. I mean, I'm going to call on you in a minute, Stephen, but for 100 years, at least academics have been arguing about what is income, what is earnings, and it's not clear we can agree on that. And again, that's one number. Is it a bit presumptuous for us to think in 10 to 20 years we'll be able to agree what at least the E part of a report should look like, the environmental part of this report, and get some consistency? Stephen, what do you think about that?
Well, if I look at what the Australian legislation actually says, it says that from the commencement of mandatory reporting, that assurance is going to be required and scaled up over time to also include Scope 3 emissions reporting by 2030. But essentially what the legislation says is that the auditor has to be able to confirm that the mandatory climate report has been prepared in accordance with the Corporations Act and they've received all necessary information. The legislation then says that what you're actually doing in an audit is entirely up to the Australian Audit and Assurance Standards Board, who obviously are going to be takers of what the IAASB actually develops. So, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what it is that is being assured. It's made more uncertain by the fact that much of what would be in a mandatory climate statement applying basically S2 as it currently stands is qualitative information rather than quantitative information. Now, auditors assure quantitative information even when that quantitative information is a model. Yeah, you can go and think about level 3, for example, mark-to-market securities. So an auditor has got to basically look at the model that's being used to come up with the number. Now, one can imagine that's a big part of what might happen in terms of auditing, for example, initially Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes down to actually auditing a kind of mini essay about risks and opportunities and an approach to corporate governance, maybe that's difficult, maybe it's not. And it might not be difficult if the big accounting firms themselves, as they've tended to in the past with accounting disclosures, actually develop guidelines for their clients in terms of what they should be saying. Unfortunately, that would mean the disclosures would be collapsing to boilerplate. But if it is boilerplate, it's not a challenge for the auditor.
Okay. Jacco, given that where New Zealand is moving quickly, is agreed upon procedures engagements an option there or not?
No, no, it's not an option. It will be at a minimum a limited assurance to start off with. I think going back what Imre says, as a regulator, what we've seen to be an enormous challenge is on the interpretation of qualitative disclosures. And I think disclosures is generally a issue, not on how you get to a number or how you get to information, but okay, what then needs to be disclosed. And we are having lots of debates with large listed entities where you have the CFO, the chairs, and saying, okay, hey, why did you not disclose this? And the answer is always, yeah, that's not material, because the reader of the financial statements will not make a different decision on that. And where we've seen most of the issues in New Zealand is with related party transactions, which is kind of has a different materiality level than your purely, okay, your 5% of profit before tax. And do you not want to know, okay, that the CEO has a significant side business and is making a lot of money out of that? Maybe does that something say about the culture of an entity, and do I really want to deal with that? So I think in this case, with a lot of disclosure, okay, what is an entity holding back, and would kind of a informed user make different decisions if they would know that information? And I think that's incredibly challenging to enforce as a regulator, because there is always about 100 people that agree and 100 people that disagree with if it's enough. So it establishing that will be quite challenging.
Yeah, let me ask Sven, what could be a dumb question, but again, I come back to this point that most ESG disclosures I've seen are a bunch, they're disclosures that stand alone. Okay, you got this one, and in Europe's case, you got the series of disclosures for the E, I assume social and governance too. Could you see or expect, and what does reasonable assurance mean? All those disclosures taken together, or some certain components of those that you could do reasonable because you have a high quality evidence, but others might be limited? Could you see that as an issue developing over time where there's actually somewhat almost a hybrid model? I mean, again, this may be a simplistic question. I'm just curious how that would reconcile, considering the information itself does not reconcile.
Now, obviously, there are lots of questions around that. As I said, we're starting with limited assurance. There's no requirement for reasonable assurance. We can actually, as a European Commission, introduce it as of 2028, depending on how the market develops. And I think that's exactly what the legislator already recognized, that it will take time for this whole ecosystem to develop, as you said, between the firms to develop their own approaches, for the standards to be established. I mean, we're following very closely what the IRBA is doing for really practice in the market to emerge. I mean, one shouldn't forget that we're doing all of this at incredibly high speed. I mean, when you look at the speed that we've developed sustainability reporting standards and are introducing assurance requirements compared to what is traditionally happening on the financial reporting side, it's two completely separate worlds. I mean, on the financial reporting side, we're always talking about research going on for 10 years and then standards being developed, while here we had like 3 or 4 years to do everything together, which I think was necessary because we're dealing with a real life problem. We need to find a solution, but at the same time, we also need to be mindful that this is really new and a lot of stuff has to be developed in parallel to the actual reporting starting already. And that's also one of the messages that we're trying to send to everyone, to the auditors and the preparers, that we have to accept that in the first 1, 2, 3 years, we will see an evolution in terms of both the reporting and the assurance of the reporting. And I think that's inevitable if you're establishing such a comprehensive framework at such a high speed. There's just no way around it.
Well, that's a natural segue to my next question, because one of the concerns I have is that we are moving very rapidly. Well, not in the United States. We'll come back to that. But it's happening because many U.S. companies are subject to Australia, New Zealand, and European regulation. But, how far along do you think we are when it comes to creating the data structures, the information capturing procedures, the internal controls, the reporting mechanisms, et cetera, that have to be all developed before we can even get to the idea of issuing a report, which has to come before the idea of providing assurance over the report? Or do you feel that progress there is keeping pace with what the rapid nature of the regulatory environment? and I'll open that to anybody who wants to touch it.
I mean, I can start if you want, because we've got a real life example here, given that this is the first year where companies will have to report on. And obviously we're engaging very closely with the companies and the auditors. And we know that on the one hand, everyone is concerned that this is imposing a burden and that it's new and that there are lots of questions still to be answered. At the same time, we're seeing really a lot of good progress by these companies and by the auditors in terms of applying this. And we're also seeing, as you said, all these kind of data solutions and possibilities to access the data being developed. Now, would we have liked to have a little bit more time? Yes, I guess. But at the same time, as I said, there is simply a real world problem to be dealt with. In the European Union, we also have very clear targets in terms of what we want to achieve, climate neutrality by 2050, other targets as well. And the political decision was that to support this development, we absolutely need this information now, and we need it to be assured. And I think the market is on a good track to get there.
Okay, let me pass this to Imre now. Yeah, you indicated you're a little behind that, but how do you see it progressing?
Now, very, very interesting to sit in Africa and see how different jurisdictions approach sustainability. You could say sustainability reporting and assurance implementation. I'll take a step back just to mention, Robert, the potential barriers. I mean, there are many barriers to the adoption of ESG reporting, especially in the developing world. We are sitting with inconsistencies in terms of political will, inconsistency in different legislative frameworks, and appetite. And then let alone that we then on the one hand already talk about assurance and reporting. So to take Africa as an example, all African countries signed the 2016 Paris Climate Agreement. All African countries were part of that agreement. But I think what we're seeing emerging now from Africa is that there's only a handful of countries that have adopted ISSB S1 and 2. One is Nigeria. They also adopted it with reliefs or transitional provisions until 2028. So what is emerging from our side, from an African perspective, is that there is a need to manage pace. We need to look at the social priorities. It's also referred to as just transition. We need to make sure that legislation and the burden of legislation and regulation doesn't impact primary responsibilities or social priorities. To give you an example, we've had a major challenge in South Africa in terms of our power plants providing electricity. So I've read last week our Ministry of Energy extended unregulated operation of our coal power plants until 2030. So on the one hand, you have African countries subscribing to the Paris Climate Agreement. Everybody agrees that we need to do something, but on the ground, if you take a country where electricity there's daily, we've had for a number of years daily disruptions. You can just imagine how that impacts on the economy, and the lives of people. So to focus on reporting, whereas you're still struggling to get the basics right, those are things that we are dealing with in Africa at the moment. So on the flip side of the coin, we're developing clean or green hydrogen plants. So there's a lot happening. It's very fluid. There's a lot happening in this space. But if we take away coal power plants, we will sit without electricity as a country. So that's why I think the pace of requirements, the pace of reporting, etc., is something that is of critical importance for us. Might not be the same in every jurisdiction, and then it's even more made even more complex in that we're not only talking here about environment, we're talking about social and governance as well. So Yeah, I think there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered before we have consistency and the full understanding and best practice in place that can be adopted cross-jurisdictional. But I just wanted to give that example from South Africa.
Well, that I find that very interesting. Stephen, you were about to say something, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think it raises the rush which is occurring pretty much all around the world. I mean, on the one hand, I've yet to meet, talking in an Australian context, I've yet to meet any Big Four audit partner who's not a wildly enthusiastic supporter of mandatory climate reporting as proposed by the government, because of course it's a significant guaranteed line of business for the financial statement assurer. But one of the challenges I think we're going to have is trying to understand what is the quality of the assurance that's being done. Over the years, audit quality, as in the audit of the financial statements, has been an issue of extensive analysis and debate. And, people have come up with ways of trying to indirectly capture the quality of financial statement assurance. And that in part comes from the systems by which financial statement data are gathered and compiled. On the other hand, I don't know that the sort of data that is going to be assured in, broadly speaking, sustainability reporting, not just climate, I don't know how easily we can assess from those numbers the quality of the assurance process on sustainability reports. I think that's going to be it's an opportunity for people to think creatively about how they can try and address this, but I think it's going to be a real challenge to try and actually understand what is the quality of the assurance that's being done.
Well, Jacco, you want to follow up on this? I mean, New Zealand has moved quickly, and I'm sure you've seen numerous challenges. What do you think are the big ones still to remain?
It's a bit of a combination between Sven and Imre. What we've seen is certain methodologies haven't been developed. So today I was dealing with an issue. Okay, what about facilitation greenhouse gases, where a bank might facilitate, for example, fund management, that sort of things? How do you deal with that? If anyone has the answer online, please email me, because we don't. And then there is the question is there enough research and willingness? Can someone make a market out of looking at, for example, the specific situations in New Zealand? We have probably 15 microclimates in New Zealand. Who's going to do the research? Is the data available on how that will develop? The answer is, who's going to pay for it? So coming back to Imre's kind of question, it's kind of, hey, you might want to do good disclosures, but sometimes people use models from other parts of the world. I can tell you, that's not how New Zealand is going to play out somewhere 3 hours from Australia in the middle of the Pacific. So it's that type of information. Hey, it might be available in certain parts of the world, but definitely not in others. And you cannot start modeling European and American data into your own country. That's not going to work. So that are some of the challenges that we are dealing with.
Well, that problem exists in a lot of academic research on auditing, that each country has their own institutions and enforcement mechanisms and culture and so on. And so it'd be very difficult to transfer what we may learn in one arena to another country. But that does actually lead to, I'm just curious about this question, because I am American, obviously, and we know that the SEC proposed a disclosure requirement a year and a half ago, which seems, I don't know how fast that's moving ahead. But do you think that when the SEC and the U.S. finally move, which I think they will, is that going to have an effect on all the rest of the world, which is way ahead in many ways, I think? And anybody who wants to volunteer for this, I'll be happy to take your volunteer.
I'm happy to give it a crack, Robert. It's kind of ultimately, we want to have reliable information that is remotely comparable around the world, because otherwise we can't do businesses with each other. So, yes, with the accounting world, it has taken about 100 years before we had IRBA and kind of get some commonality, and then the US does something different, but kind of, hey, it's still comparable, I believe. I don't think we have the luxury of time in this field to wait for 100 years to get developed practices. But I think it has to be given some time So most of the regulators and legislators are working through a 5-year period. So I think in 5 years' time, we probably know where everyone stands, and hopefully from the next 5 years after that, we try to seek commonalities in reporting and in assurance. But that maybe is my dream. But I think it needs to happen, because otherwise you can't do business with each other if you have all different information.
Anyone else want to add to that? Yeah, Sven?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, obviously, I can't comment on the US process, but I mean, I can very much echo what Jacco said, that, I mean, what's needed is some level of comparability globally on all of this. I mean, what we've tried to do is we go relatively far compared to others, which was a political decision. At the same time, in our law, it also clearly says that what we do should be interoperable with what is being done at the international level. So we spend a lot of time discussing this with the ISSB. And so basically the parts that mirror or that exist in parallel to what the ISSB has already done, so on climate and cross-cutting requirements, I think we've really achieved a very high level of interoperability. But at the same time, we do go further, but I think that's fully in line with this idea that the ISSB has always postulated, which is, I mean, it's a global baseline, but then anyone's welcome to kind of build on that baseline, because I think also at this stage, at least, sustainability reporting is different from financial reporting, that there's a much bigger interplay. And maybe that's also what Imre said, with the political environment, the political situation that you're in, maybe even the economic situation that you're in, and somewhat that needs to be reflected. But if we can get the basics aligned or interoperable, I think that would already be a good step forward.
Okay. Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
I think the US is going to be fascinating in a way, because if we assume, as you did, Robert, I think that at some point, some form of mandatory sustainability, starting possibly with climate, some sort of mandatory sustainability reporting will be there in the US. The assurance process in the US with respect to financial statement data is kind of interesting, because unlike Australia, the PCAOB is both a standards promulgator and a sort of regulator / enforcer. And I think that is an interesting question about how that process would or would not work with regard to sustainability assurance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's actually a really important question. It's not clear to me. I'm a member of the advisory group for the PCOB, and this is just beginning to percolate, I think. I think one reason is that until the SEC decides what they're going to do, it's not clear what we should even be talking about from an auditing standards point of view in the United States. But you're right. I mean, it's not going to go through IAASB standards necessarily, because the U.S. has this tendency to go its own way anyway. So we'll see how that all plays out. We're getting to the end of our time. I just wanted to throw out a very open question about, again, we've been auditing financial statements for a very long time. And almost as long, we've been talking about the so-called expectation gap between what auditors do and what people who rely upon that assurance think. And I'm just curious, are we going to have the same problem occur here eventually? What might cause it? Why might it not be such a problem? Do you have any thoughts on what might evolve to that once we get to the point where we've got some kind of steady state approaches to these issues? Any opinions, ideas?
I'll give it a shot, Robert. So I think the expectation gap, if it's in the financial, existing in financial reporting, it will certainly exist in sustainability and reporting and even assurance. The way I think the standard setters have approached this in anticipation of the expectation gap and inconsistency is to take a collaborative approach with key stakeholders. For example, we all as regulators, we're very much aware of the coordination between IAASB, ISSB, and IRBA, and even other local standard setters and the regulatory community to ensure that consistency and alignment in the process in anticipation of addressing inconsistencies and expectation gap. Because the expectation gap is as a result of inconsistency in understanding and inconsistency between between different reporting framework, different levels of assurance, etc. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around awareness, education, advocacy, sharing of knowledge. And I think we're in the middle of the runway as far as that is concerned. I don't really think that sustainability reporting and assurance, that the plane has taken off yet. I think we're on the runway. Some are lagging behind, some are ahead of the curve. But essentially, everybody's scared of the expectation gap, and therefore, not to be left behind. We all need to be in the room. We all need to make sure that we understand what's happening, and then compare and use that information and do what's best within your own jurisdiction. But there'll always be there will be inconsistencies for all the variables that was mentioned in today's session. To cater for that, one last point is we've adopted voluntary adoption, unlike the US. We've adopted voluntary adoption to make sure that whoever needs, assurance or reporting on sustainability, local South African companies that are part of bigger cross-border operations and companies, big companies, can do so and comply with rules and regulations of other primary listings. But everybody's working, I think, together to make this work, and should be.
Thank you. Jacco, I'm going to turn to you, but I want to direct you in a specific direction if possible. We've heard the term IRBA a number of times in this session. For those in the audience who don't know what that is, it's the International Ethics Standards Board. And I think, based on these conversations, and we have some agreement on what the information should be. We have some agreement on how you approach assurance. But ethics is, to me, my mind, a bit of a wild card. Could you see that as a source of expectations gap if different providers are using different ethical standards as to how to approach engagements?
Yeah, and I want to bring it back to the overall approach from an audit as well. I think three bodies are responsible for making this a success. First of all, the entities themselves, so they have to have ethics as well, Robert. So when preparing the information, they should be accountable as well. Then you got to the assurance provider, similar. You have to apply the ethics code and do the right thing. And then finally, you should have a regulator that is overseeing that and hold people accountable. So I think if those three things work well, you are able to close some of at least the outcomes, hopefully, and that people can trust the information. I would say that most of my day is kind of trying to explain what our climate disclosures are and what they're absolutely not. We are not a political organization, so we don't tell what companies need to do. They need to disclose honestly what they are doing. So again, if everyone takes up their own role and take that seriously and be held accountable, I think we might get there with the expectation gap as well.
Okay. Sven, has your group had conversations about this?
Oh, sure. I mean, again, I think it's a big challenge given the extent of the reporting that needs to be done and the assurance provided. And I think also it's different stakeholder groups that come in here. I think we're not just talking about, say, traditional investors, but you're also talking about customers, you're talking about clients, you're talking about affected communities. And I think the whole question of, say, greenwashing and presenting yourself as something which you aren't comes in as well. And I think that's a big challenge. It's also something that some of the auditors, I think, worry about, how they'll be able to do this. But that's the very essence, I think, of what we have to do here, because it's not just a question of saying, okay, the preparer has gone through a number of procedures and has looked at a number of things, but in the end, you also need to take a step back and say, okay, does this actually fairly present the situation of this company when it comes to their sustainability impact, or does it actually give a picture which is not overall in line with what they're doing? And I think that's what many of the users of these reports are looking for. And I think it'll take us a bit of time to get there, but I think it's absolutely necessary, because if we don't do that, it will not provide what it needs to provide.
Stephen, we're out of time, but I'll give you a chance to give a short response if you want to that question.
I totally agree with Sven. I think the expectations gap that currently exists is a reflection of the role of financial statement assurance in assuring information that's used for investment decision-making purposes. But the demand for sustainability reporting is a much wider stakeholder range. Exactly what that means in terms of expectations about assuring the information, I don't think we know at this stage.
Well, I tend to agree with you on that. And I think that we're going to find unfulfilled expectations in many corners that we have never even thought about before as an accountancy profession. Anyway, on that note, we are out of time. So I would like to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion. You made my job very easy with your forthcoming comments. And I hope the audience learned a fair amount about the state of nature as far as assurance over sustainability. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to the panel.